is an interview by Roland Matthies of Bill Stumpf, S-T-U-M-F, in his home in Springfield, Ohio, on April 21, 1995, period. Where you came from? You came from your mother's womb, I know. You take it from there.
Well, this is mostly about Bonded Oil, so I don't need to have a lot about me. But I was raised in Springfield and graduated from Springfield High School in 1944. And of course the war was on, and I went into the Navy V5, V12 program at the urging of Boyd Young, who was a counselor at the school at that time.
Oh, yes.
And
where did you go?
And they put us in military uniform and everything and sent us right straight to college. And I went to Oberlin College. I was there for 1 semester. And then they transferred us to southwestern Louisiana. And we were there for 3 semesters, which took us into 1945, which is just 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And because the war was over, they were closing down some of those units, and I got transferred to Tulane. After a short while at Tulane, it was either sign up for 4 more years or get out of the college program. And I went then to back here to Springfield.
I take it you got out of the college program.
Yeah. But I had 3 years of college, actually college, in a short period of time. So I had a very good start.
Was it a business or an engineering?
It was engineering at that point, and civil engineering. And so when I came back to Springfield, I worked that summer at the YMCA because my brother and I had worked there a lot in the past. Went back to school in the fall of '46, and went to Kent State. And I went straight through at Kent State summers and everything, and graduated in March of 1948.
Good for you.
In business.
Mm-hmm.
I switched calculus and things like that for business math. Then I came back to Springfield, and my mother was in business here in town with Turner Wells Company at that time. And she knew a lot of people, and she said that a lot of people want to talk to you because they need employees. And of course, everybody else was in college. I was ahead of them because of my 3 years of college in the service. So March '48, I went to work in the Springfield Savings Bank. And Don Weagle talked me into coming to work there.
Oh, yes.
And I went through a lot of things there, from bookkeeping to tellers to loan officer, and decided to try to get my CPA. And in those days, you had to have 4 years experience before you could sit for the exam with a CPA, public accounting. So I left the bank, went to work for Jack Wood, and worked for him for a few months. And Dick Kuss called me one day and wanted to know if I would come talk to him at Bonded.
Oh.
And so Jack Wood didn't like it very well, but I left and went to work for Bonded as office manager and accountant.
That was the end of the CPA.
Yeah. At the end of 1951, that was. And
the old office on High Street?
Old offices on High and Yellow Springs. And at that time, I went in as office manager and accountant, and I had 6 girls working in the office. And
can you name some of them?
Mabel Mobley was one of them. It's hard to name some of the others.
No, it's not important.
I could have, if I had thought longer about it. But they had just opened 4 stations in Cincinnati, and that was 3 stations in Cincinnati, 1 station in Columbus. And those stations and the books were about 6 months behind, because they had a couple of people in accounting that didn't stay. They also were adding on to the office, and the office practically had to close down during the construction. And they kept things going with the stations and the reports and everything, but the actual bookkeeping was, I say, about 6 months behind. So when I started, and we got help with Ernst & Ernst at that time out of Dayton, we got everything cut back up, and the books in those days were done by hand, three-page checkbook with wrote out by hand, and we did get a machine to help do some of the payroll.
Now, how many stations did you have in Springfield?
And at that point, we had three stations in Springfield, 4 stations in Springfield.
As I remember, Bill, these 3 stations you were going to build in Cincinnati were the ones we financed at Wittenberg?
Those are the ones that you financed at Wittenberg.
Out of the endowment fund.
Right.
And if I recall correctly, the interest rate was 4%.
4%. And there were some others besides those 3 that were financed to Wittenberg.
There were. And I handled the paperwork on those.
All right. And but Bonded Oil started in 1932 here in Springfield when Mr. Deere moved from Indiana. He and his father had been in a city service jobbership called George W. Deere Company. And they had a fellow working for him in bookkeeping at that time, but Wilbur Barnett. And so Mr. Deere had this dream of coming to Ohio and starting the same kind of an oil company that a friend of his, 2 friends of his, Williams brothers, had started in Indiana called Gasoteria. And they were service stations that specialized mainly in service and gasoline. They had gravel driveways, 1 or 2 pumps, and they were all located on railroad tracks. And so when they moved over to Springfield and they moved into a house or apartment on Limestone Street, and Mr. Barnett came with them, Wilbur Barnett, and because he was interested in this challenge of getting things going. And say they made their home in Springfield, but the first station was in Urbana, at the same location where the Urbana station is now. That's station number 1.
Is that right?
The station that's in Urbana now is about the 4th rebuild of what we had, but it was there. The number 2 station was in Marysville, the north side of downtown on Route 4, by the railroad tracks and the grain elevators. Station number 3 was in Wilmington, the downtown, south of the downtown, on the railroad tracks, and next to a grain elevator. And also, the station driveway was built like a bridge because there was a stream in front of the station, between the street and where the pumps were. And then station number 4 was the station at Yellow Springs and High where the office was. And it went on. Station number 5 was the one which was on the railroad tracks at the bottom of the hill at Main Street, close to Lagunda Avenue. And that station was later moved up to the top of the hill because they were going to make an underpass underneath the railroad tracks. And so the station went up to Greenmont in Maine. Well, lo and behold, a few years later, instead of being an underpass, it became an overpass. And the station at Greenmont in Maine had to be moved back farther north, away from the intersection, and that overpass went in.
Now, why always near a railroad track?
Because before the war, most all the gasoline came in on railroad cars. And they would have a spur, or they'd bring it close to the station, and they would hook up hoses, and the gasoline would run from the railroad cars into the underground tanks.
Oh, directly up? Is that right?
Right. Gravity. And in those days, the underground tanks were were big. They usually had to put in a couple of 10,000-gallon tanks, or maybe 3 10,000-gallon tanks, because the railroad cars would hold like 20,000 or a little over 20,000 gallons. And in fact, the first 21 stations that Bonded had were built on railroad tracks.
Well, now that's interesting.
And some of them are still in the same locations. But of course, during the war then, the trucks and of course the railroad cars were used for military use and everything, and the tankers and trucks started bringing the product in. And they used to tell some interesting stories of, because it was gravity and those tanks were sitting out, and in the summer, of course, it get tremendously hot. And you would get what you call vapor lock, or air pockets in the lines, and it wouldn't flow.
Yeah.
And our stations attendants were there, and they would have to try to get the gasoline out. They would sometimes go by ice, big kegs of ice, and climb up on the railroad cars and drop the ice down into the gasoline to cool it, to get rid of the air pockets. And of course, gasoline and water don't mix. When people talk about water being in gasoline, and that's a misnomer, because water is always at the bottom of the tank. Your automobile tank or your service station tank or whatever it is, because they don't mix, and the gasoline goes to the top. But some of the old guys used to tell a lot of stories of Oren Sign, who still lives here in Springfield. Has to be way up in his 80s now. He was probably one of the oldest employees that Bonded had.
Oren Sign?
Oren, O-R-E-N-S-I-N-E. And they live out in the just west of town, off of Route 40. And let's say they're still around, and he used to tell some interesting stories about getting the gasoline moving. Ralph White, who was an employee of the company at that time, his son, Ron White, still works for Bonded, or EMRO, out in Enid. And he would tell some of these stories. Marion Crummy, who was our personnel man for many years, and passed away a few years ago, would tell those stories. And John Wright and Dan Wright, both who live here in Springfield, and they left International because they were tired of the layoffs and went to work at Bonded. And they both tell those stories, and they're about my age, and have retired for several years. And I see them quite frequently. And but they would tell these stories about getting the gasoline
I never heard of this.
to run. And but Bonded continued to grow, and of course Dick Kuss was working for the company at that time. He was the son-in-law. And after Dick and Barbara got married and Dick got out of the service, Dick, interesting enough, was in the V5, V12 program like I was. When he got his commission, because he was a little bit older than I. And when he came back, he finished school, and he was fortunate enough to get to go to Harvard Business School for, I suppose, a couple semesters. And when he went to work, Mr. Deere says, we'll put you to work, and you can start the stations and do this other stuff. And if you don't feel comfortable doing this because you married my daughter, you can leave anytime you want to. And if we don't feel comfortable, you can leave anytime you want to.
Where was he buying the product at that time?
When they bought it from the railroad cars, of course, it was kind of like open market, buying it from wherever you could buy it. When I started, we were buying from Gulf Oil. Most everything was coming from Gulf in 1951. They had a contract with them.
Was that in Lima?
Most of the product came out of Cincinnati. They had a terminal on the river. Gulf had a terminal just outside of Cincinnati on the river. And most of it came up there. And as the years went on, our contract then changed, and I can't tell you exactly when, but it would have been in the 50s, to Pure Oil Company. And Pure Oil was headquartered in Chicago. And the president and his name slips me, but his Milligan. He was originally from Springfield, and so they got together, and Pure Oil supplied us with our gasoline for several years, and they had a terminal out here on South Limestone Street. They put that big tank in where it's now Clemens Oil, and some stuff came in on pipeline. They also, the Pure Oil stuff came from Dayton, and in Columbus they had a terminal. And then of course those oil companies, whether it be Pure, Gulf, or whoever they were, they exchanged also. You know, we'll use Gulf gasoline in our Pure stations in Cincinnati, and you can use Pure gasoline in your Gulf stations in Columbus. And they traded around like that. Then we signed up with we were getting our motor oil from Pure Oil also, and they canned it with our names on it and all that stuff. And then we switched over to Sohio. And Sohio then canned our oil for years, and they had a oil canning plant up here in Lima. We used to go up there, and because in some days we had contests where we put plastic chips in the oil cans, and if the customer or even the employee would get a can of oil that had one of those chips in, they were worth various dollars, from $100 to $5 to another can of oil. And when those chips went in there, one of us from Bonded Oil had to be at the Lima plant where the canning was, and as the cans went by before the top was full, we'd have to, and they were going by pretty fast. So we'd throw them, and sometimes you'd miss the cans, and you'd have to pick them up off the floor and throw them again. But we had that contest for several years. I keep rambling around here.
That's all right.
Talking
That's good.
in different ways, but when we're talking about our supply, we were with Pure for a number of years until we finally struck a deal with Marathon. And then we can talk about Marathon later, because that became quite a long-term relationship.
What were you doing all this time?
Well, I was an accountant and office manager for about 4 or 5 years, and we had to get more help. We had some more girls in there, and they needed help in other parts of the company. And we did have Don Deere, who was Mr. Deere's oldest son, and Don was kind of looking after the warehouse and the supply, getting the products to the stations, and all that type of thing. And of course Dick was actively involved in sales and sales contests, and going along those lines, and everybody, when they could, was trying to look for new locations. And so about that time they decided to hire somebody, and probably one of the easiest people to hire, not being trained in the oil business, would be an accountant. And so we looked around, and that's when Bob Kircher was hired. And Bob came in about 5 years after I did, so it had been about 1956, I suppose, or so. And Bob had worked for Hearst and Ernst, was working for Hearst and Ernst, and left there and went to work for some other company for a short while. And the Ernst and Ernst people said we might be able to get Bob Kircher to come, so he came in as accountant. And so I worked with him for a year or so on getting switched over into an accounting of the oil companies and how we did it, because we kept a separate set of books on every station we had on a spreadsheet. We knew what every station's sales were, expenses were, profits, and of course you had to assign overhead and things like that too.
Now, about that time, how many stations did you have? And were they all in Ohio?
No. About that time we were probably up to about 35 stations, because we had bought some from individual was sitting around. In 1958, we bought a company called Verkamp Withrow in Cincinnati, and they had, I think, maybe 9 stations. A couple of them were in Kentucky. But we had stations in Kentucky. We had a station in Ashland, Kentucky, which was number 17. So it was put in, before World War II. Mm-hmm. And we had two stations in Huntington, 18 and 19, in Huntington, West Virginia. So they were put in before World War II also. Mm-hmm. And then we bought those stations in Verkamp Withrow and changed those over to Bonded, and that got us into like Covington, Kentucky, and Earlier, Kentucky, into that area. And there was one in Louisville, and so we had to take that too. And then a little later, there was a breakup of the former Gastown Oil Company not Gastown, Gasoteria in Indianapolis, which was the Williams brothers. And one of them, the Williams brothers, had died, and the widow took some of the stations because they had a fight, and she called the company Surety Oil Company.
Surety?
Surety, which meant the same thing as Bonded. And she had stations in Indianapolis and Louisville, and we eventually bought those. But she wouldn't do business with Mr. Deere because Mr. Deere was a friend of her Williams family, who she got the stations from. So Mr. Barnett and I made up that deal, and we formed a new corporation called Surety Oil Company. And he was president, and I was vice president. We had a lot of corporations through the years. In fact, we incorporated a lot of our stations individually. And then Bonded was the management company. The stations were managed by Bonded Oil Company.
But you didn't franchise any?
We tried some dealer operations for a little while with a few stations, but it just didn't work because we didn't have enough mechanical stuff. And the dealers were very poor in gasoline and that type of thing. They wanted to tear cars down and put them back together, and they thought that's where they made most of their money. Mm-hmm. And that was not our cup of tea. Our cup of tea was to company manage the stations as much as we could, pay the salaries and various commissions. Most of the commissions in those days were based on oil and oil changes, and depend on the percent. If you would sell 3 quarts of oil or 3 gallons of oil for every 100 gallons of gas you had a 3% oil average, and you got a pretty good commission for that. Uh-huh. And of course, in those days, you used to preach changing oil in cars every 1,000 miles, and we tried to sell them a flush job when we changed the oil. You take the oil out, then you put flushing oil in, run the car for 5 minutes, take that out, and then sell the new permanent oil. Uh-huh. And we tried to sell oil filters and paid commissions on those. Through the years, well, in the very beginning, we tried to private brand a lot of our products, and we did it with the Gasoteria Oil Company in Indianapolis, the Williams brothers I was talking about. And we would buy products together. We would buy oil together and we'd put the Bonded name on them, and they would sell Bonded oil in their Gasoteria stations, like for motor oil and this type of thing. And Wilbur Barnett designed most of the logos that we used at that time. He was a very good artist. Oh. And it was pictures and paintings, and could write Old English and all that. Uh-huh. He was fantastic at that as long as he could see. And long after he retired, as long as he could see, he was still doing that. And so we got into private products. Eventually we split off from the Indiana company and did our own private products. And after I left accounting and got into sales work and was running these contests and buying the products and setting up the contests and designing the signs, having those printed that we put up at the stations. We had we even had our own silk screen shop for a while. We would silk screen the signs and said what our special was, whether Valvees or motor oil or whatever the price was. And we got into batteries, and we sold batteries and tires. So we got the bright idea of having private brand batteries and tires. And we did business with a Gould battery out of Zanesville for a while. Then we went with General battery out of Reading, Pennsylvania, the Nosneski family. And because they were selling Sohio, and Sohio, the guy at Sohio thought we ought to be doing business with them. So they private brand our batteries. And we had our tires private brand by Cooper in Finland. And they made the same tire for different people, but they would take out the plate and put Bonded in the plate. And of course they only cool down the molds once a week. So whenever you got on a mold of a certain size, you had to take a week's production, at least a week's production in that size. And so sometimes we had a lot of tire inventory. And because they couldn't change the mold out. And they would help us get rid of the extra tires, but we did that. And then in the late 60s, I guess, maybe early 70s, it was really getting to be a chore because the tire sizes were changing. They went from 15-inch tires to 14-inch tires and balloon tires, and then the radial tires started coming in, and it got to be a mess handling the inventory and trying to sell them. And so we got out of what we call the TBA business, tires, batteries, and accessories. And concentrated then on the cigarettes and candy in the stations, and the gasoline, motor oil, and those were our big items.
Well, you were still changing oil.
We were changing oil probably up until in the 70s. We were still changing oil. But you know, all of our facilities were outside. The station that we built on East Main there by Greenmore was the only station that had inside lube base. And what we had in most areas was pits, where you drive your car across the pit and the guy walks down in underneath it. Even in that station on Main Street that had the bays inside, there were still pits that you walked down under. And except a few cities wouldn't let us put those in because thought they were dangerous, so they made us put in outside lifts. So the lifts were outside. And you lift the car up and change the oil. Dick Kuss had a lot of dreams and ideas. He got us into the popcorn business. We had outdoor popcorn machines at one time in our stations. And got into fishing poles, and we got into trash cans, and we got into peat moss, and many different things that we sold outside, and fertilizer. Oh yeah, and alcohol that you put in your radiator. We used to sell antifreeze, but of course the ethylene glycol got to be reasonably expensive. And a lot of the people with the old cars didn't want to put that in because they had leaks and it would run out of their car, and that ethylene glycol permanent antifreeze wasn't permanent for them. And so we still sold alcohol and had drums of it at the stations, and people put alcohol in when a cold snap would come. And so we went around and we bought all the gallon jugs, glass jugs that we could find in the state of Ohio. And by the stations, and people bought cider in them and all this kind of stuff, and we'd take them to the stations, and we'd fill those up with alcohol and sold them glass jugs of alcohol for $1.98 or something like that. And particularly when there was going to be a freeze at night, we would have an alcohol rush at the stations. We'd have to call all the employees in. And it would cold. And they'd get in, and they'd have to get down in the car and open up the petcock and let the water out. And then they'd buy the alcohol and pour the alcohol in, or if they didn't buy it out of the jugs, they bought it out of these containers that measured it, a quart at a time. And it was a mess. And us from the office, like here in Springfield, we would go to the stations and take them hot coffee or a hot sandwich or something like that, because they might be on duty most all night, putting alcohol in these cars for people so that they wouldn't freeze.
I never realized that.
It was tremendous alcohol rush. And when we start talking about motor oil also, we used to sell a lot of motor oil in bulk. We had what we called high boys in the stations, and they would hold about 60 gallons. They were square and they'd have a pump on top, and people would get, that oil was cheaper than the canned oil, and people would buy a lot of that, and we would sell that to the folks, and the thing was that you had to handle those 55-gallon drums, because we had, the motor oil came in 55-gallon drums, and we had people that could really handle, I mean, do more than just tip them up. And it was always a mess to fill them ourselves. We fill them out here in a warehouse and haul them to the stations. And the stations would, some people would buy it by the drum, like a contractor, like A.G. Samuelson. They used to buy motor oil by the drum. But most of it had to be transferred into those high boys so that you could pump it out with like an old pitcher pump. And then that was the one way that some of our employees could cheat from us on a time or two. They would open that up and drop a brick or two down in the oil tank, that high boy. And of course that would raise the level, because we would stick them all the time to see what the level was. You know, there's a stick in there, 200 gallons. And if there was a brick or two in there, then that would take the space of 3 or 4 gallons of motor oil.
Oh, gee.
So that's one of the things that our supervisors had to check. Dick thought that the people were buying cigarettes from someplace, and we might as well be in the cigarette business of selling them in the stations. And so in the early 50s, we started selling cigarettes in the stations, and put up signs and cigarettes at that time, 17 cents for a pack. And in those days there was only 6 kinds of cigarettes from the 6 different manufacturers. And we bought our cigarettes from local people, like in Springfield we bought from the Bozart Company. And because they were selling the cigarettes, and we would sell them cheaper than anybody else was selling them. Of course, there was always state law in Ohio and Kentucky and West Virginia that you had to have a similar to a minimum markup law. You couldn't sell them below cost, and you couldn't give them away. And the same thing beer has now too. And so cigarettes just kept becoming bigger and bigger for us, and more sizes and more kinds of cigarettes became on the market. And it just got big and big, and then they started promoting. The cigarette company can promote cigarettes, but we couldn't. So they would come into the stations and sometimes Scotch tape a cigarette lighter to the pack of cigarettes in order to promote the sale of Marlboro or whatever kind it was. And Dick thought we ought to be going beyond this and getting into more of the profit in the cigarette business than just being the retailer. And so he wanted me to find out how to go about it. So I started going to the state tobacco convention, Ohio Association of Tobacco Distributors. They'd have a state convention once or twice a year. And I went to those, and I started meeting some of the people, and that some of the wholesalers that we had been buying from in other cities were all at those conventions also. And then I started going to the national conventions, And it was very difficult to become a tobacco wholesaler or distributor because it was closed either with the mafia or with the families, or the other tobacco distributors didn't want a new tobacco distributor coming into their town. And so as going to those conventions, I made some friends. And I made one friend, his name was Kurt Judge. And he was sales manager of R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company. And he invited me to come to Winston-Salem, which I did on the way to Florida. The family was going to Florida for vacation. And I went into their plant in Winston-Salem and got treated very royally. And pretty soon he said, it's time the tobacco industry starts recognizing the people that are selling our products and do something different. And he says, I'm going to put your company on direct. And so we quickly formed a new corporation called Key Supply Company, and they made us a tobacco distributor. Well, the other 5 cigarette companies weren't going to let one company get ahead, so they put us on direct also. So then we started buying our cigarettes directly from the manufacturer, brought them to Springfield, or have them delivered to Springfield. And then as a distributor, we put the tax stamps on. We had to get a machine. First we did it by hand. You got roll stamps, and then you had to use like an iron to heat the cellophane onto the cellophane pack and tax stamp. Then we got a machine that did it, and we had some ladies down there, and we assigned a fellow by the name of Kenny Beller to be our cigarette man. He was a supervisor, lived here in Springfield. He still lives here. He's retired now.
Where did you do all this?
And we formed a place next to our warehouse on Water Street. We bought the old Springfield Gavir building down there. And they moved out to Commerce Road. We bought that because it was next to our warehouse. And we had our maintenance in there, and we put our cigarettes in there. And it became fairly large, and so we started shipping them out to the other cities. And we got bigger and bigger and had to hire a truck to do it and everything. And so then we thought, well, maybe we can get bigger yet. And so we talked to Halsey Bozart, and his dad was still in it at that time, Gene Bozart. And they had a little place on Main Street.
I remember.
Where the...
Across from the Shawnee.
Yeah, where the M&M drive-in window is now. That's no longer there. And at the time we were talking to them, they were looking at the building on Commerce Road. No, they were looking at the building on North Yellow Spring Street, at the dead end of North Yellow Spring Street. And some auto dealer had that for a garage at one time. And Halsey was looking at that building. And so at that time Dick Kuss and I talked to Halsey. His father wasn't in town at that time. And he thought it might be a good idea if they would sell the business, because his dad was getting very old and was not very active in the business, except he had the purse strings. And so we worked out a deal at that time and bought their business and kept Halsey as the manager of that business for a period of time.
I remember the father.
Gene Bozart.
Yeah.
And we took it over as they moved into the Yellow Spring Street.
This was what year?
1967, I believe, when we bought the tobacco operation. I think we'd started our own in 1965, but I think we bought Bozart's in 1967. Then we added on to that. We more than doubled the size of that building. And I was president of the Bozart company at that time. But I was only working basically as oversee. I was still working full-time at Bonded, doing not just sales work, but also doing most of the location work, trying to find new locations and handling some of the construction and everything.
When you went with or took over Bozart, what was your volume would you say, in a year's time?
I think that the business was around $2 million, the Bozart business at that time.
A volume?
Now that includes tax, when you measure that. When we eventually sold it, it was 200 and some million.
Is that right?
Of course, there's a lot of price increases in there too.
Yeah. Now, when you took it over at 2 million, were you then bound to do business with competitors? Or were you just doing business with Bonded?
No, we tried to do business with all the competitors we could. We tried to keep all the Bozart business because they were doing all the mom and pop stores in the Clark County area. They were not selling just cigarettes, but they were selling candy, and they were selling meat wrapping paper, and they were selling bags, and they were selling matches, and they were selling everything that these mom and pop stores would need.
That's good to get on the record.
Yeah, and that was all. That was all part of the 2 million, and it was part of the.
So you continued.
We sold the London prison farm, and not just cigarettes and candy, but they sold them paper and all that kind of stuff.
So you kept that on.
We kept that going, and they had 6 salesmen on the road. Bozart did at that time. 4, and then we hired 2 more and made it 6. And I think even today, in its present form, that 2 of those guys are still working. And but after with Bozart, we built that building on down there, and we knew that Halsey was going to think about retiring, even though he didn't want to, but he was thinking about it. And so we went out and bought another business in Piqua. Roger Overholser and his wife were running a little tobacco operation, distributorship in Piqua. And they were selling candy and stuff, and he had formerly worked for a candy company. And so went up there, and we bought his business, his inventory, with the understanding that he would come to Springfield and start working at Bozart's and eventually take over as general manager from Halsey, which he did when we were down on Yellow Spring Street. And it got bigger and bigger, and that business then was sold, Bozart and Bonded Oil. We got some other things to catch up on. Bonded Oil was sold to Marathon in 1975. And then Bozart was sold to Marathon in 1979. And then we needed more and more space to keep operating the Bozart operation. And that's when we built then on Commerce Road. And we built that 64,000 square foot building in 1982.
So you stayed on with the Bozart line even after Marathon bought it?
Yeah. I was on both sides of the fence. I was the president of Bozart for the Bozart owners, and the Bozart owners was not really Bonded Oil. It was Dick Kuss and Randy Deere, financed by Bonded, and they were the owners. That's why when Bonded Oil was sold to Marathon in 1975, the Bozart business did not go at that time. But Dick and I then worked out a deal with Marathon in 1979, and I was furnishing all the figures. I was president of Bozart in 1979 to Marathon, and I was also working for Marathon through Bonded Oil as a Bonded Oil employee. So I was on both sides of that deal.
Oh, so.
And the people that were financing it kept wanting figures, and I'd have to keep getting figures again. This game was to you yesterday, and I have to go get them again. And as I say, I worked out both sides of the deal. And was Dick's share at that time went to Whitman. That's when Dick made his large contribution.
Wow.
And and that went in there.
I didn't know that it had come from that source.
But back in the early 60s, we were trying to market our gasoline product in our bonded oil stations. And we thought, instead of doing this as home ingrown people, we ought to get some help. So we contacted a company out of New York at that time to come in and look at our business, look at our logo, look at our advertising, look at our marketing, look at our colors, and all that. And they came in the early 1960s and made many recommendations and told us about changing our colors, about changing our uniforms, and changing the logo, and about advertising, and how to market. And so we did a lot of those things. And we also went on television marketing after we got our new logo. And that logo was the one you still see if you see Bonded around. The red, white, and blue.
Mm-hmm.
And with the black Bonded in the middle of it. And it's not rectangular shaped, it's got the point at the top and the bottom. And our business started moving when that happened. The advertising, the new colors, the logos,
Really took off.
the happiness of our employees. Okay. At that time we had a program we called OTC. We painted a yellow line around our gas pump islands, big enough where all the cars would park and everything else, and put the letters OTC. And we called that our carpet. And the OTC was always on the carpet. And we tried to make a rule in all of our stations that always somebody would be on that carpet when you drove in the station. If they weren't there, then that was bad. I mean, we didn't want them in the back room getting oil or anything else, unless they were all busy doing something. But it had to be on that carpet. So that was a marketing program that really caught on, and people liked that. Then we got into the whistle program, and realizing that the people could not be on the carpet all the time, or if they were on the carpet, but there was 2 or 3 men on duty, when you came in as a customer, we blew the whistle, and that meant the guy come from the back room, from the trash can out, and we'd give you 1-man service, 2-man service, or 3-man service. Doing the windows at the same time we were doing the checking the oil, and the battery, and the radiator, and all that, pumping the gas. And of course, you had to hold the nozzle on the gas. And we had the programs of washing the windows on the cars and making sure that there's no bugs on them. And we had our people carry a little plastic bottle in their pocket so they could spray the window, take the paper towels and do the windows. And of course, when they were doing the back window, you always rubbed your body up against the car to make the car move, so that the people, my car moved, when they look in the mirror and they see you washing their back window. And and then the whistle thing got publicity every place, and it became a recognition thing for the customer. Customer said if you didn't blow the whistle when they came in, what's the matter? You recognize me? And so the whistle thing got to be a big deal. And then we went one step further, and we got into red brooms. And that became a big deal. And we got a clip for all of our people. They put it on their belt. And we went out to Vining Broom, and Fred Leventhal made up whisk brooms for us, dyed red. And we bought those by the thousands and thousands. People stole them and wore them out, and lost them and everything else, but we used thousands of them.
Were they premium or sales?
They were sales. We sweep out your car. And of course the guys were sweeping out chicken bones and everything else in cars, and the dirt, that became quite a gimmick. This is all going on about the time this advertising was starting.
Uh-huh.
And our sales just zoomed. We had to cut out the red broom thing sometimes at night and things like that, because the guys would get in the cars and somebody could hit them over the head or whatever. And, but all those things were important for part of the time, and became wonderful for us. I mean, it really helped the business, and it went up. And I say, in the meantime, we had gotten rid of a lot of the tires, batteries, and accessories. We did sell some those things for a little while afterwards at some stations, but concentrated mainly on the gasoline and the cigarettes. And of course, the cigarette business, nobody sold under us. And finally, some people started matching our prices. But we would sell those and serve them to the customer at his car. And that was unique. Mm-hmm. And usually you'd have to go in, of course. A lot of people were using cigarette machines in those days. And we had the problem with our night people. Our stations were mostly open 24 hours a day in those times. With the cigarettes, we had designed different cabinets for them outside, so the cigarettes would be out at the island, and the main supply would be in the back. But we went to stationery stores, we went all kinds of places trying to find cabinets to put cigarettes in. A lot of them were low cabinets, and that meant the guys had to stoop over, and then pretty soon we got bigger and bigger. More and more cigarettes, we got bigger cabinets, and cabinets that were 6 foot tall. But we still had a problem with the night people, because that was a lot of cigarettes for one person at night, and trying to handle them and account for it. And I went to a company in Chicago that made machines for, it turned out to be for Bally, which is the slot machine company. And Bally has the casinos and stuff. And they were making cigarette machines for other companies. But the mafia was not about to sell me cigarette machine. Now, I did not want cigarette vending machines. I wanted a cigarette shell, and the slots that they put in them and things like that, so that our night man could get the cigarettes to serve to the customer and not have them all exposed at one time. And he would put the money in his pocket. And, I mean, he wouldn't put them in a machine to get the cigarettes out. And they would not sell me that those days. So eventually we went to a company that made lockers for schools, metal lockers for schools. And they designed some, with our help, some cabinets that the top part had slots in it that you could put the cigarettes in and pack. The bottom had cartons in it. And then eventually they also bought more lockers so that we could put them in the back rooms of the stations so we could count cigarettes. So that we knew that a locker would hold 6 half cases, and each half case had 30 cartons in it. And that was 300 packs, and so forth. Well, the cigarettes became big like the gasoline. The stations in Kentucky, where the tax was 2 cents a pack versus 15 cents a pack in Ohio, became big sellers of cigarettes. People coming through and going, people who worked in Cincinnati, worked in Middletown, lived in Kentucky, would buy their cigarettes in Kentucky, bring them up. We had stations in Kentucky that we had to build separate warehouses just to put cigarettes in. People would buy 30 cartons at a time and bring them in. And the cigarettes, of course, in recent years, what's happened to them because of the health and all the other things. But it seems as though that the EMRO share, the bonded share, which is now through their speedway stations and all the others, the volumes have not been hurt very much, because the other people did not carry the same variety of cigarettes. They didn't have the same prices. And so their market share is about the same, even today. And a lot of other people are not selling them. And of course, the cigarette machine is almost a thing of the past.
Yeah.
Because if you buy them out of a cigarette machine, you're talking about $2 a pack. Mm-hmm. And even in those days, cigarettes machines were minor. I mean, they were, a cigarette machine average nationwide was 90 packs a week out of a cigarette machine. We had stations that were selling 90 packs an hour. And then even beyond that. And we were selling more cigarettes than supermarkets. And in those days, we were not getting paid the advertising allowance from the cigarette companies because we did not have them on open display. They would only pay if you had them on carton racks where a customer could walk in. Well, we couldn't do that outside by an island. Mm-hmm. And so eventually we got the advertising money that the supermarkets were getting, and it became a big, big business. And I thought eventually when self-service came along that the cigarette business would die because the people would have to walk up to a cashier. But it didn't. It just became big. But back in the early days when we had our stations, our people did not have cash registers or anything like that. Cash registers, was next to impossible to operate in a service station. And you probably remember seeing a lot of our stations, guys would carry a wad of bills. Mm-hmm. We tried not to have them carry them in their pants pocket, but they would carry them in their shirt pocket. They had a button flap on it. And they had a money changer on the front. And they'd make change out of that. And then we had Kuwani safes in the back room, in a iron safe that stuck up above the floor. They were in the tube was in the cement, but stuck up above the floor and had a door on them, not a door, but a round thing that you could take out with a key, but it had a slot in the top, and the money would go in the slot. And of course, we tried to get them to, every time you get $100 or whatever, put it in the slot. In the old days, it didn't make any difference because you'd go all day and get $100. And but our people also in their stations were responsible for everything in there, and every shift change, which essentially was 3 times a day because you had the night man too. Everything was inventory. You read the meters on the pumps. You read the meters on the high boy oil tanks. You counted every can of oil, every pack of cigarettes, every valve stem, every valve cap, whatever you had in the station. And the difference between your opening inventory and your closing inventory is what you had to have the money for. Mm-hmm. And you had to have the money. And if you didn't have the money, then there had to be a slip filled out, and you would sign it, and it would come out of your paycheck. And of course, I mean, it was sometimes you would work with people until they got onto it, so they could make change and do all that. But in those days, in the early days, they were making 60 cents an hour. When I started in 1951, our part-time help was making 90 cents an hour, and the regular full-time help was making $1 an hour. The managers and some of the others were making more than that and getting commissions. And of course, all the pay was low in those days. When I came out of college, I started in the bank for $1,500 a year. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so that has gone up and up. So eventually the money thing got to be bigger and bigger as the products went up, the taxes went up, the volumes went up. The money just got to be very big. And in fact, we never used cash registers really, and we tried to use them a few places. Even when we had the little stores, Even when we went self-service, we did not use cash registers. We tried to use them. I think one of the first places we tried to use them was in Urbana when we remodeled that and put in a little convenience store and we're selling fried chicken and stuff on the side. But they never really became a part until after Marathon was involved and EMRO and Speedway and computers came in. And it was strictly a hand-done thing. Mm-hmm. Of course, a lot of those stations, we had to put in, as time went on, separate safes, 2 and 3 barrels, not just for the volume of the money, but because we had to have different people in charge of different money, so they would have their barrel and somebody else would have his, mm-hmm. and you'd leave money for the next guy coming on shift. After that happened, after we started closing. Let's say for years we never closed except on Christmas. Close on Christmas Eve and open up at 6 o'clock Christmas night. Always open 24 hours. Until the gas shortage started in the early 60s. No, late 60s. And we couldn't get enough gas to stay open all that time. And so we thought that that was a good time for us to start closing. Well, we had to change our whole operation for sure. Have a guy close and then have somebody new come in the next morning that wasn't there when it closed. And so the money functions had to change a lot. And the way you did the inventories all had to change. And during that shortage in the late, it would have been early 70s, when it was really short, we opened our stations 6 hours, 3 days a week. And of course, we let go all the part-time people, but all the full-time people we kept on. And when I say 6 hours, I'm talking about 6 hours for gasoline. Some of those stations we kept open for cigarettes, other hours. They had people there. But we kept paid all the full-time people the full pay during that period, but that went on for about 3 or 4 months. It was open 6 hours a day, 3 days a week.
I can't remember that particular time.
It was very short, and I think it was in around 73, something like that. And that's when they had the big gas lines. The stations were open. And I went to Florida during that period. I remember one time I got in a gas line that was an hour and a half long. And, things began to change, of course, when we sold to Marathon. But everybody stayed on in Springfield. And we run the company in Springfield. And Dick Kuss remained president and Bonded. Then they previously had bought a company that they had financed earlier called Gastown in Cleveland. They had about 300 stations. We had about 250, I think, 280 when we sold. And they wanted to bring those in to operate like we did. And so that's when they formed a new company called EMRO. Now, EMRO came from those call letters of Marathon Oil Company, which was MRO, and they put an E in front of it and made the word EMRO. Mm-hmm. So EMRO Marketing became the company that they put Bonded Oil in, that they put Gastown in, that they put Checker Oil when they bought Checker Oil, that they put Speedway in when they bought Speedway, and a whole bunch of companies through the South. And Dick Kuss became president of EMRO Marketing. And Bonded Oil was a division of EMRO Marketing. Gastown was a division of EMRO Marketing in those days.
And what were you doing there?
And I was still working with Bonded and Bozart. And I was mainly trying to get locations. And a lot of the locations in those days, we were buying out other companies. Some of the locations we were getting were marathon stations that were closing. Some of them were companies that wanted to sell out, or that Marathon had been selling gas to them in the South, because Marathon was and may still be the largest supplier of independents in the country of fuel. And Marathon, in the meantime, had bought a big refinery in Louisiana. They already had a refinery they bought in Detroit, and a big refinery in Robinson, Illinois, had a refinery in Texas City. They were doing all this offshore drilling, and so then they bought a small refinery in Indianapolis, and they bought another one down south someplace. So they were out buying, and they were putting all the stuff in the EMRO Marketing's name. They weren't putting the drilling and all that stuff, that remained Marathon. The refineries remained Marathon. But all the marketing and all that stuff was put in EMRO's name. Mm-hmm. Dick was president. Of course, Dick was wanting to retire. Randy was gone by that time. And they brought a person in from Marathon, Ray Graham, and he became Dick Kuss's assistant for a year or so. And he eventually replaced Dick as president of EMRO Marketing. Then Ray died. Ray got caught up in Marathon's cutting of force in the 1985 or 84, something like that. Ray was only 53 years old when he had enough money through the Marathon retirement plans and all that stuff. Then he retired and then died a year later. Mm. But Marathon started making some changes because mainly in accounting. And of course, Marathon had their own problems in 81, 82, 83, when they had the takeover.
U.S. Steel?
Well, that was a friendly takeover with you. They merged with U.S. Steel to keep Pure Oil or somebody else from taking them over. Oh, Mobil Oil wanted to try to take over, and so they merged with U.S. Steel to get out of the takeover business. And then, of course, U.S. Steel started making some changes as times went on, mostly accounting changes, and they didn't change our mode of operation. But what I was going to say about Marathon, in 1975, when they got involved, we started working closer and closer with the Marathon people. And they had turned some Marathon stations over to us to operate as Bonded, as they turned some over to Gastown. And self-service started coming up in Kentucky, Indiana, a little bit in West Virginia. And we changed a few of our stations to self-service, trying to find out the best way to do it, how to do it with the equipment that you had, or whether you had to get all new equipment and everything else. And they were mostly conversions. And Jack Herring, who was vice president of Marathon, in charge of their marketing and things like we were doing, he said, I would like to see the first station in Ohio that's opened as Marathon, or as self-service, to be a bonded station. And Marathon, or Ohio self-service, is not going to be legal until January 1, 1979. And I want Bonded to have a station ready to go at midnight on January the 1. So he said we could take one of the old Marathon stations, which we took in Findlay on South Main Street, and we completely rebuilt it, tore it down, new tanks, everything else, and built it as totally a self-service station with a building in the back for storage and for a little office. But we had a kiosk on the island for the cashier, and have 2 or 3 islands so the cashier could see it. Have a canopy with the lights, have pumps that are controlled, electronically controlled from the kiosk. Because in the old days, on the self-serve, we just put a key lock on them, and the attendant would would turn the pump back with a key, and you just operated the old pump. And then they experimented with wiring those old pumps so that the operator in the office could turn them on and off and everything. And oh, so much trouble with those. And there was so much trouble with the new electronic pumps too. And they're nothing like what we have today. So on January the 1, midnight, we had a crew up there. And 12:01, they opened that station. That became the first self-serve station in Ohio. And it was operated as Bonded, and of course it's still there with new equipment and all that other stuff now. So then we started converting into self-serve. And we converted a lot of the stations to self-serve that were in tough neighborhoods. And as we did that, we had to fix them up with bulletproof glass. And I'm talking about glass that was 2 inches thick. And we had to learn how to use that ourselves, because a lot of that glass is not glass, but it's a plastic. And you can't wipe them off with a paper towel, for instance, because you scratch it. And so we had to learn how to use those kind of things. And things started getting tough in a lot of the neighborhoods, and so we went to a lot of that bulletproof glass and having the tenants inside. And we remodeled a lot of them. And Marathon became more prevalent in the business, and we were looking at them, and they had an engineering department, even though I had 2 engineers working here in Springfield, and we designed our own stations and supervised the construction and with our engineers here. But then, of course, a lot of that changed, and you started drawing plans on computers. And so they worked with the engineers in Findlay and drew plans on computers in Findlay, but we still supervised them from here. And then, of course, the EPA, they became so much involved in the later years with tanks and the type of material you could use, and if you did have a leak, what you would get involved in. And I mean, we used to have leaks in the old days. Somebody run a gasoline tank over, filling it with a truck or whatever, and you call the fire department out, and they come out with their hoses and flush it down the sewer. And now you spill a gallon on the ground, and you got to call EPA, and they want $10,000 to clean it up. And, but the EPA made so many changes in the way we built stations. Our first station in Urbana was probably built for $5,000. We were building other stations for $10,000. When we built those stations in the 50s, we were probably building them for $30,000 and $40,000 plus the land, and we wouldn't pay over $40,000 for land, and that had to be a good location to pay $40,000 for land. And that meant put them together with leases and maybe buy 3 or 4 pieces of land and all that, and then kept going and going and going. And this one over here, of course, was almost $1.5 million when it was built. This one at Durroad and Villa. But they kept going up and up as time went on, and a lot of it was not just construction costs, but I mean it was the requirements by EPA and all the others.
Bill, you told an interesting story, I tell you.
Well,
it's fantastic.
There's a lot of different parts of it.
Finally, is EMRO totally owned by Marathon? It's not a public corporation.
No, EMRO is not a public corporation, and neither is Marathon.
That's right.
It went to U.S. Steel.
Right. Now,
U.S. Steel has split off the company, and when you look in the newspaper, there's USX is their call letters.
Yeah.
And so it's USX, USS for steel, USX, M for MR for Marathon.
Oh.
So there's two stock prices.
Oh.
And they split that stock. Didn't actually split it, but it wasn't equal. But I mean, the stockholder got part of both. And as a lot of companies have done. But EMRO is now totally part of Marathon. When I left,
What year?
in 1986, I retired August 1st, 1986. In the last 2 or 3 months that I was there, we knew that Marathon wanted to keep EMRO's office in Springfield, Ohio. And they wanted to close the offices of like the Gastown division that was in Cleveland, the Speedway division that was in Indianapolis, the Checker division that was in Chicago, and bring those to Springfield. And we knew that, and we were talking about getting all that into Springfield and where we could build for it. And so I got some of the Marathon people together and Ray Graham here in Springfield, and we went down to the Chamber of Commerce and talked to them about building this office in Springfield, Ohio. And it was going to be several hundred employees. And we were talking about downtown Springfield, and the Chamber was talking about downtown Springfield. And Kissel was also talking about building a large office in downtown Springfield. And what they were talking about was where the YMCA is now, all the way down there, clear down to Washington Street, where the Kuss Auditorium is now, and across the street, that they would build 2 big buildings and a parking garage, and we would all be involved in it. Bonded would be involved, Marathon, EMRO would be involved in one, Kissel would be involved in the other. So in the meantime, I said, well, what can we do for EMRO? And so Larry Cookwood came up with the idea that they wanted to build a spec building out of Prime, Ohio. It would be a manufacturing building, but they don't know who would go into it, and he wanted to build it similar to a couple of those on 6th Avenue as you go around Columbus. He said, we'll build that building, and EMRO can move into it as an office. We put a false ceiling in it for the temporary until the new stuff comes. Well, in the meantime, EMRO moved out there, Prime, Ohio, and it worked out wonderful for him. But the Kissel thing fell through, and EMRO still wanted to build a building. And by that time, they had appointed, well, after Ray Graham died, Gary Buracher took over as president of EMRO, and another fellow by the name of Ray Schultz. And so eventually Gary became president, Ray Schultz became vice president. And it was big. It got to be a big company like it is now. And 1,500 stations or something like that. And I think Gary didn't want all that responsibility himself. And so Marathon brought Riyadh Yamin in. Riyadh Yamin. Spell it. R-I-A-D is his first name, and Yamin, Y-A-M-I-N-E or something like that. He's Lebanese, and he's been with Marathon for years. And he was president of the pipeline company. And he also was Marathon's representative to the United States Fuel Supply Commission, or whatever it is, that decides where the fuel is going to come from in time of emergency, and filling up those tanks in Louisiana and all that kind of stuff. And I spent time with Riyadh Yamin when he was still only Marathon. And in fact, one night we sat in a motel together, and he was describing to me there how you can build pipelines that are earthquake-proof, which was very interesting, and that was part of his business at that time. Well, anyway, he came to Springfield to take over as president of EMRO Marketing, and still maintains 1 day a week in Findlay and 1 day a week someplace else. And so it became, one of his first tasks was to become involved in a new home office for EMRO. And so there was all kinds of things, and everybody worked on it, from Dick Kuss to me, to Dick Link, to the Chamber of Commerce. the city people, and it became a tax thing. But we had so many people that, because Bonded's office on North Limestone was not in the city. It's still not in the city. And so there was no income taxes involved for anybody that did not work in the city of Springfield. And so a lot of these guys that were coming to work for EMRO were being transferred in here, were coming into Springfield, giving up their homes in Chicago and Indianapolis and other places. And they had $300,000 houses in Chicago or wherever it is. And when they come to Springfield, they couldn't give up their $300,000 house because they gave up their capital gain, and they would have to pay tax on it. And they didn't want to get a $300,000 house in Springfield because they said, if I'm transferred out in 6 months, how am I going to sell it? So most of them were going to Beaver Creek. So still they're not paying city income tax. And if they didn't work in the office in Prime, Ohio, I mean in the building itself, they didn't have to pay the city income tax. So the city income tax became a big issue. That's why they went to Enid.
Oh.
And, it's mainly a tax thing. We wanted that in Springfield.
Sure.
And of course, there's 600 employees out there now.
600.
Because they've closed all the other
Yeah.
offices, so to speak. And it's a beautiful place. And,
Sure.
I mean, it works well, and they get along with all that. But it sure would have been nice to have it in downtown Springfield.
Anywhere in Springfield.
And they've done, well with Springfield, and on the Mozart business. After I retired in 1986, we built that building in 82. They started taking over so much of the other marathon business in Chicago and everything else out of here. So they built a 100,000 square foot addition on at that time. That's the one where the roof fell in, part of it.
Oh, yeah.
It was in the news. And now this year they've built another 50,000 onto that. Now,
It's on Commerce Road.
yeah, but now that's not Marathon anymore. Marathon sold that in 1984, the whole business, to a distributor called E.B. Brown. E.B.Y. Brown.
Oh, I've seen that truck.
All the trucks are being painted. Everything's being done. And Marathon got some capital out of it that they could use for further expansion in other places. They still signed an agreement that they would supply the Speedway stations in the same area. They don't supply the ones down south. I'm talking Florida and Georgia and those places. And Marathon still gets a good deal because they get all the advertising allowances. And so they don't have the headaches of running 100 and some trucks.
Wow.
They bought 70 some trucks from International at one time. Now there's over 100 trucks, some big, some.
Where did E.B. Brown come from?
They came out of Chicago. There's two brothers, and Dick and Tom, and I've met them in the past, and they're only in their 30s. And they and their father bought a distributorship in Chicago a few years ago, and got involved, and the father died. So the two boys have done well. They've done a lot of service.
Are they located here?
No.
No.
They bought a warehouse in Indianapolis, and so then after this deal went through, they are closing their Indianapolis warehouse, and they'll just be in Springfield and Chicago, outside of Chicago. But they do spend time here, and they're both president of the company. They're not co-presidents; they're both president. And they're nice young men. They've made a lot of changes. Some of the employees, changes rattle some people more than others, and some of them are still there, and they're getting along fine. The ones that had a lot of seniority and did not want to become part of the EMRO thing, or I mean the E.B. Brown, were transferred back into EMRO, either in Enon or as a supervisor in some city, you know, around the country. Because they have, I believe they have 1,900 stations now in 22 states or something like that, close to that. They're buying and selling some stations because they're not easy to supply here, but they're easier to supply over here. So they sell those off to somebody and they buy some from somebody else. And they're remodeling the ones that they can and putting the name Speedway on them. All of them, no matter what name they have on them. Checker, Globe, United, all kinds of names that they bought. If they can, they put the new Speedway name on them. Some places that they have not remodeled, but they're still doing a good volume, but they don't have the space to remodel. They've left those Bonded or whatever they might be, United. Some of them they have remodeled, but they haven't changed the sign because of the sign zoning laws. For example, the one on North Main Street in Dayton has the sign that we had on it in 1950s, not even the new 1960 sign. It still says Bonded, because if you change the sign, if you change the face on the sign, you have to move it. Right now it's sitting on the corner. And this is in that bad district, Dayton, where they pick up all these prostitutes and all the other stuff. But if you move it, change that sign, you have to move it back. So it's still Bonded.
Well, Bill, I can't tell you how interesting this has been, really. I just had no idea you had that much background.
Well, there's a lot of interesting stories that have gone on through the years.
A lot of history there. Yeah.
You know,
thanks a whole lot. It's been great.
Someday, if you want more, maybe think up some more ideas.
Okay.